What is the Juche idea? I am sure many have heard the term, but few comrades can define the term with socialist precision. Outsiders often translate Juche as self-reliance, imagining a nation of people stoically living on tree barks and ideology alone. Ask a North Korean, and you might get a recital of dense slogans rather than a clear answer. If you go hardcore and read some official Juche scriptures, they only leave readers in clouded confusion, not knowing what this thought is really trying to say. Yet, Juche is everywhere in the hermit kingdom. This idea is carved into monuments, blasted from loudspeakers, invoked to justify everything from grain harvests to missile tests. Juche is the official ideology, a quasi-religion, and the all-purpose explanation for the DPRK's unique path of development. Comrade, let's start from the beginning. Juche literally means subject or main body. It denotes the idea of being the master of one's own destiny. It's often defined in lofty terms, as Kim Il-sung's original contribution to socialism and a philosophy that puts man at the center of everything. The state propaganda describes it as a worldview in which the masses of the people are the masters of the revolution and construction, and the driving force of revolution. On paper, it sounds empowering and humanistic. However, in practice, Juche demands absolute loyalty to the leader and absolute perseverance to oneself. Juche preaches that human beings are protagonists of revolution and nation building, while maintaining such autonomy requires the people to obey the leader who holds absolute authority. Juche has been the bedrock of North Korea's official identity for decades. It outlived Marxism-Leninism in North Korea's constitution, fueled waves of mobilization, and gave the Kim dynasty an aura of doctrinal invincibility. In this episode, we will explore how Juche was born from communist power struggles, how it evolved into a quasi-religious commandment, what its core tenets are, and how it affects the everyday life of a North Korean citizen. Before we begin, a brief but mandatory expression of gratitude. This channel, much like the Juche idea itself, survives through self-reliance. But unlike Juche, our self-reliance is not metaphysical. It is entirely funded by you, our loyal channel members. Your monthly contributions ensure our research and production continue uninterrupted. Thank you. All right, now, let's begin.
The Kim Il-sung Square, located at the heart of the city, looks straight to the tower of the Juche Idea across the Taedong River, soaring on the bank in East Pyongyang.
Once upon a time, it was the mid-1950s when Kim Il-sung was consolidating his rule over a nascent North Korean state. The Workers' Party of Korea was faction-ridden. There were pro-Soviet cadres, pro-Chinese veterans, local partisans, and Kim's own Manchurian guerrilla comrades. The guerrilla hero Kim held the top office, but vicious rivals lurked in these factions. By 1955, after eliminating the domestic communist faction, he turned to neutralize the pro-Soviet and China groups. To purge them all, he desperately needed a justification, a reason beyond personal power. Openly accusing all opponents of treason and sending them to labor camps wouldn't fly without evidence. On December 28, 1955, Kim Il-sung delivered a landmark speech titled "On Eliminating Dogmatism and Formalism and Establishing Juche in Ideological Work." This was the first official introduction of Juche. In that speech, Kim didn't explicitly fire Marx or Lenin, but he strongly criticized those Workers' Party comrades who, in his view, were slavishly imitating foreign models. He argued that some cadres only knew how to quote Stalin or copy the Soviet Union, while others touted Chinese methods, and that this dogmatism was holding back the Korean Revolution. Kim asked, "Why quarrel over Soviet versus Chinese ways? Is it not time to create our own way?" To legitimize the Great Purge, Kim asserted a new principle. First and foremost, a Korean revolution must serve Korean needs. The Korean ruling ideology must incorporate the idea of Juche, the mastership or subjecthood of all Korean people. While Marxist-Leninist principles from other countries were valuable, everything must be applied in the context of Korea's reality and interests. In essence, Koreans needed to invent a Korean socialist model for Koreans. All other theories and ideas are just lessons from the past. This reasoning turned factional strife into a righteous ideological cause. Kim wasn't killing his dear comrades because they opposed him, but because they lacked the spirit of Juche. But who defines the meaning of Juche? Only our great leader Kim Il-sung. When he says you are too pro-China, too pro-Moscow, too dogmatic and no Juche, you are doomed. However, Kim Il-sung had to perform a delicate balancing act. In the 50s communist world, overt nationalism was an international taboo. As Internationale claimed, every proletarian from the world should be united. And as our comrade John Lennon said, "Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do." In this atmosphere, creating Korean First doctrines certainly attracts accusations that North Korea was straying into nationalist, even anti-Soviet territory. So our leader took pains in his 1955 speech to stress that Korea's unique path was still part of the global socialist movement. He argued that loving Korea equals loving the Soviet Union and the socialist camp, because the workers' world has no borders. The true patriot is an internationalist, and the true internationalist is a patriot. This brain-twisting dictum, nationalists are internationalists, and internationalists are nationalists, left listening comrades scratching their heads. But it served its purpose. Kim wrapped his particularist line in orthodox Marxist language. It suggests that we Koreans are not nationalists. Creating our Korean-style socialism ultimately serves world communism too. After this 1955 speech, the term Juche quietly circulated among party cadres, though it wasn't heavily publicized right away. Kim Il-sung still presented it as a tweak to Marxism-Leninism, not a replacement. The next catalyst for Juche's development came in the early 1960s with the Sino-Soviet split. Caught between two quarreling communist giants, North Korea skillfully played one against the other to extract aid. But by 1963, as Beijing and Moscow's feud worsened, Kim Il-sung faced pressure to choose a side. Initially, he leaned toward his fellow guerrilla hero, Chairman Mao, especially after Khrushchev's de-Stalinization and advocacy of peaceful coexistence with the West. Kim quietly stopped reprinting Soviet publications in North Korea and curtailed contacts with Soviet diplomats around 1962. Sensing this betrayal, the USSR suspended aid to North Korea. This aid cutoff was a turning point. Bereft of Soviet support and wary of over-relying on China, Kim Il-sung doubled down on Juche as the guiding line. In February 1963, the great leader formally laid out the core principles of Juche: political independence, economic self-sustenance, and self-defense in national defense. These three became known as the three principles of Juche. He warned that new army recruits must be educated in Juche ideology to resist revisionist influence. In October that year, Speaking to military academy graduates, Kim asserted that a soldier armed with the Juche idea is more powerful than a soldier armed with modern weapons. How exactly ideology was mightier than firepower was left unexplained. Perhaps the Juche-trained soldiers can shoot laser beams from their eyes. Kim also pointed proudly to claim that the kingdom was then more self-sufficient, like producing its own military uniforms and rations instead of importing them. After that speech, the DPRK leadership hiked defense spending from a mere 3% of the budget in the early 60s to about 33% by the decade's end. All the money and resources were spent to build an independent arms industry and no longer beg the Soviets for weapons. By then, Juche had evolved from a vague slogan into a comprehensive policy line. It meant, we Koreans will not depend on others, not for ideology, not for our economy, not for our security. If Moscow didn't pay for North Korea's modernization, North Koreans would tighten their belts and do it themselves. If China were in cultural turmoil, North Korea would not follow Mao's erratic lead. In 1964, Khrushchev was out, and the new Soviet leadership under Brezhnev began repairing Stalin's legacy and taking a harder line against the US. The ideological rift between Pyongyang and Moscow narrowed. Then, China's Cultural Revolution began in 1966, and it was viewed by Koreans as a chaotic mass movement with alarm. Kim Il-sung was deeply concerned that the radical Maoist ideas of permanent revolution might spill into North Korea and inspire challenges to his authority. Thus, Kim pivoted back toward the Soviet camp to some extent, cooling relations with an unstable China. Throughout this timeline, one thing remained consistent. North Korea would chart its own course and allow no foreign ideological interference. In July 1966, Kim launched a nationwide ideological campaign to establish Juche absolutely across society. Party members were ordered to study Kim Il-sung's works diligently, ostensibly to root out any lingering dogmatism. Inspired by China's cult of Chairman Mao, North Korea began to elevate Kim Il-sung's writings and ideas as the ultimate truth. By 1967, the regime introduced the concept of the monolithic ideological system. It requires the entire party and population think with one ideology and obey one leader. An editorial in the party newspaper explicitly called for complete, military-like obedience. Citizens should emulate anti-Japanese guerrillas, regard Kim Il-sung, the supreme leader, as the sole commander, and become his true revolutionary warriors. It urged, all the people must become guerrilla fighters who obey the commander's orders completely. Then, the 1970 Party Congress wrote Juche into the WPK Charter as the party's guiding idea. 2 years later, the 1972 State Constitution enshrined Juche as the official ideology of the kingdom, alongside Marxism-Leninism. Now, propaganda officers boldly asserted that Juche was not just an offshoot of Marxism-Leninism, but a new, superior version of socialist ideology. In 1974, the term Kim Il-sungism was introduced, defining Juche as the revolutionary thought of the Juche era, newly created and original, reflecting the demands of our time. It was only after the Cold War, in 1992, that North Korea finally dropped Marxism-Leninism from its constitution. By then, it was safe to fire Comrade Marx openly. The Soviet Union was gone, and Pyongyang no longer needed to pretend ideological loyalty to anyone else. Juche stood alone as the sole guiding ideology of North Korea.
Lesson 1. The origin of the Juche idea. The Juche idea is now spreading to all continents, transcending latitudes and longitudes, and the flag of Juche flying in every part of the world.
If Kim Il-sung was the political driver of Juche, the job of turning this rather amorphous concept into a full-fledged philosophical doctrine fell to some comrade else. Kim was a brilliant guerrilla leader and a shrewd politician, but he was not a philosophical theoretician, since he didn't even finish high school. To elevate Juche to a grand theory that could rival Marxism-Leninism, Kim leaned on the talents of Hwang Jang-yop. Hwang Jang-yop was a seasoned Marxist philosopher and one of the few highly educated intellectuals in Kim Il-sung's inner circle. Born to a well-off family in 1923, Hwang studied law in Japan in the 40s and later philosophy at Moscow State University, where he earned a PhD. His sojourn in Moscow led him to befriend Kim Il-sung's younger brother, Kim Yong-ju. After the Korean War, Hwang returned to the north and rose rapidly. By the mid-1950s, he was teaching at Kim Il-sung University and eventually became its president. Known as a loyal party man and an erudite mind, Hwang was entrusted with important ideological work. He became Kim Il-sung's chief ideologue, serving as a secretary of the Workers' Party Central Committee in charge of propaganda. Despite his loyalty, Hwang's career nearly derailed in the late 1960s. During the university's 20th anniversary, Hwang authored a suspicious political thesis that raised some eyebrows. At the ceremony, Kim Yong-ju unexpectedly attacked Hwang's paper as anti-party revisionism, and Kim Il-sung himself nodded in agreement, publicly criticizing Hwang by name. This was a bombshell. Hwang was stunned. Almost overnight, the regime treated this eminent philosopher as a potential enemy. He was subjected to harsh self-criticism sessions and investigations. His father-in-law's coincidental attempt to defect to China only worsened his plight. For a man who had dedicated his life to the party, it was a bewildering fall from grace. Hwang struggled to make sense of it. As he later recounted, he had sleepless nights pondering why a devoted party intellectual like him could become a target for purge. The incident forced Hwang to confront a broader question. Why were fratricidal purges so common in communist movements? From Stalin's terror to Mao's Cultural Revolution to Kim's own internal witch hunts, Hwang saw a pattern: comrades persecuting comrades, all in the name of ideological purity and class struggle. How could the very ideology that promised human emancipation lead to such frenzied infighting and unjust disasters for loyal communists? In early 1967, as legend has it, Hwang Jang-yop had an epiphany. One night he awoke as if from a nightmare with a revelation. The root problem was Marxism-Leninism's emphasis on class above all. The doctrine of class struggle, he concluded, inevitably bred internal conflicts and purges within the revolutionary camp. Stalin justified his dictatorship as serving the proletariat. Mao's Red Guards persecuted class enemies in the name of protecting the revolution. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung was purging officials under the banner of defending the working class and Korean-style socialism. To Hwang, it now made sense. An ideology that elevates one class's interest ends up as a form of class egoism. That class egoism, in practice, devolves into leadership egoism, since the leader always claims to represent the class's interest, and it eventually becomes a full-blown cult of personality. Class struggle, taken to extremes, becomes a struggle of everyone against everyone, all for the sake of the class, until only the dictator is left standing. This was Hwang's critical diagnosis of Marxism as implemented by Stalin, Mao, and even Kim. Then, what was the solution? Our philosopher's answer was to eliminate the concept of class altogether. He pointed out a simple paradox. Marxism says human history began with a classless primitive society and aims to end with a classless communist society. Class divisions are a temporary product of history. So why, Hwang asked, should we make class the nucleus of our worldview? Should not the focus be on people, those real human beings, rather than an abstract class category? Hwang argued for a people-centric view of history and revolution. In his reformulation, the driving force of progress is the people's desire for independence, also known as Juche, not the conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie. He asserted that philosophy should guide humanity as a whole toward development, and that revolution should strive for the well-being of all people, not one class lording over another. He proposed, we should take the people as the center and think from the perspective of all humanity's interests, changing the fate of all mankind as our goal. Following this line of thought, Hwang Jang-yop began to craft a new ideological framework, essentially creating the philosophical foundation of Juche. He took Kim Il-sung's political ideas of self-reliance and infused them with a humanistic, idealistic twist. The result was what North Korean texts call Juche philosophy. Its primary tenet: man is the master of everything and decides everything. In other words, man, in the collective sense, is the decisive force in shaping the world and his own destiny. This was a bold departure from classical Marxism, which emphasizes material conditions and class relations. Instead of dialectical materialism, Hwang's Juche philosophy was essentially a form of dialectical humanism or idealism, elevating human will and consciousness above all. To a Marxist theoretician outside North Korea, Juche philosophy is a strange beast. It shares almost no DNA with orthodox Marxism. Well, it ought to be this way, since Juche was developed as a reaction against Marxism. Hwang himself described it as a reverse of Marxism. And now, North Korean theorists could openly criticize the Marxist notion that the economic base determines the social superstructure as overly rigid. In Juche theory, the working class is no longer singled out as an inherently privileged class. Instead, they speak of the masses, or people, as the heroes of history, which can include workers, peasants, intellectuals, soldiers, essentially the whole nation. Such a philosophical breakthrough helped Hwang Jang-yop to rehabilitate his stance in the party. Kim Il-sung, having secured his monolithic rule, found utility in Hwang's grand new theory. North Korea began to publish works elaborating Juche philosophy. It was Hwang who ghostwrote many of Kim Il-sung's theoretical treatises in this period, systematically expounding the Juche idea in philosophical terms. By 1972, Hwang had largely completed the theoretical edifice of Juche, just in time for Juche's inclusion in the new constitution as the national ideology. That year, the first batches of academic textbooks on Juche philosophy were published, and Kim Il-sung's speeches started referring to it. Under Hwang's systematization, Juche was presented as a complete ideology on par with, or even above, Marxism-Leninism. It consists of a philosophical principle, a socio-historical view, and a guide to practical revolution. North Korean media would later boil this down to slogans like independence in politics, self-sufficiency in economy, self-defense in national defense, and the people are the masters of the revolution and construction. Kim Il-sung, of course, took full credit as the founder and author of Juche. Hwang Jang-yop remained behind the scenes as an unnamed intellectual architect. Only many years later, in 1997, Hwang made global headlines by defecting to South Korea, and then revealed his contribution to the Juche ideology. In exile, Hwang became one of the regime's harshest critics, admitting that in his decades of work, he had essentially built up a mythology to deify Kim Il-sung. He described North Korean society as filled with lies and deception, and lamented how a philosophical system had been twisted into a tool of tyranny. Hwang's defection ironically confirmed what outside scholars had suspected, that Juche's polished theoretical structure was not the work of the great leader, but of learned ghostwriters like Hwang who worked behind the curtain. Nonetheless, the deed was done. Juche had been codified into a series of authoritative texts and lectures, and it elevated Kim to a status of philosopher king, supposedly having solved questions Marx and Lenin never did. Marx and Lenin were respectfully acknowledged as revolutionaries of the previous era. But North Korea now has the much more scientifically advanced Juche Idea. By the time of Kim's 70th birthday in 1982, they even built a 170-meter Juche Tower in Pyongyang, as if to signal that Juche had now fully supplanted the old Marxist dogma. In sum, with Comrade Hwang's contribution, Juche transformed from a vague idea in a 1955 speech to a comprehensive state religion by the 70s. It had its creation myth, which Kim Il-sung supposedly conceived Juche back in his guerrilla days. Its doctrine, which was well elaborated by Kim's ghostwriters, and its evangelists. I mean, the party propagandists who fervently push it at home and abroad. Juche was now sacred, the ultimate truth in North Korean discourse, not to be questioned.
Lesson 2. Fundamental Principle of Juche Idea. This lesson is on the fundamental principle of the Juche Idea. The primary component of the Juche Idea is the philosophical principle. The philosophical principle of the Juche Idea clarifies man's position and role in the world. All systems and contents of the Juche Idea is based on, developed by, and run through with the Juche-oriented philosophical principle.
From a pure philosophical standpoint, the Juche Idea sounds inspiring, even reasonable. They shift focus from materialism and class struggle to human agency and national autonomy. But how did this idea, invented to prevent Leninist brutality and dictatorship, end up creating Kim's personality cult? To understand this paradox, we must examine the internal contradictions and unique flexibility of this ideology. Contradiction 1. People are the masters versus obey the supreme leader. Juche rhetoric ceaselessly proclaims the people's role as masters of the revolution. Yet, in practice, the doctrine places one man in an almost divine position above the people. The official Juche theory includes a concept called the leader principle, or the Suryong theory, which is rarely known to outsiders. North Korean texts explain it using an organic analogy. The leader is the head, the party is the body, and the people are the arms and legs. The body and limbs must obey the head. Without the head, the body cannot live. In another formulation, a father gives life to a child, and the leader gives political life to the people. The leader is the benevolent father of the people. Just as children must obey their father absolutely, so the people must be absolutely loyal and filial to the leader. This is literally how the Juche pedagogy teaches children. So, while man in general is the master of his own destiny, in North Korea, your destiny doesn't have any meaning unless it is given by the leader. The people are masters only when they follow their supreme leader's will. In effect, Juche theorizes and sacralizes authoritarianism. It taught that true freedom and true independence for the masses come from their unity under a great leader. Thus, the Juche ideal of people-centered socialism ends up looking very much like other leader-centered dictatorships. The master has to obey the higher master, so to speak. Contradiction 2. Self-reliance versus dependency. Juche's most famous translation is self-reliance. The North Korean narrative credits Juche for all the nation's achievements, claiming, for instance, that North Korea stood firm without imperialist help or superpower patrons. But the historical reality is that North Korea was heavily dependent on foreign aid and technology for much of its existence. In the 50s and 60s, massive aid from the Soviet Union and China fueled North Korea's post-war recovery and industrial boom. North Korea's self-made heavy industry was often an import of Soviet or Eastern European designs and equipment. Kim Il-sung skillfully solicited resources from fellow socialist nations without relying on himself. The Cholima movement, a Stakhanovite push for high-speed industrial growth, is lauded as a triumph of Juche spirit, yet it took place while North Korea was drawing extensive loans, fuel, and machinery from the communist bloc. Into the 70s, North Korea continued to receive concessionary trade deals. Only after the Eastern Bloc collapsed did North Korea truly face a test of absolute self-reliance, and it resulted in the disastrous famine of the 90s. During the arduous march, Pyongyang quietly accepted shipments of grain from the UN, the US, South Korea, and China, never saying no to these generous foreign life-saving gifts. However, the Juche principles never fail. Instead, they internally spun these incidents as the benevolence of Kim Jong-il's leadership guiding the country through a heroic struggle, while blaming natural disasters and American sanctions for hardship. Even as reality forced North Korea to lean on others for survival, Juche remained untarnished. For example, in 2013, Kim Jong-un described new economic management policies, which included giving factories more autonomy and allowing farmers to keep surplus produce, as the Korean-style economic management method embodying the Juche idea. This linguistic dressing allowed the regime to reconcile pragmatic policy shifts with ideological purity. A market economy reform could be justified as enhancing the people's creativity and initiative, thus actually a fulfillment of Juche, not a deviation. Such flexibility makes it hard to understand North Korean policies from a Juche perspective, because the definition of Juche has changed so many times that it has essentially become a meaningless label encompassing everything the Kims considered useful or praiseworthy at any given stage. In other words, Juche can mean whatever the leader wants it to mean in the moment. The core values of national independence and people's unity, also known as family rule dictatorship, remain, but beyond that, it's all elastic. Contradiction 3. Hyper-abstract language versus plain realities. Juche writings are infamously abstract and verbose. They favor statements like, "The ideological consciousness of the popular masses is the decisive factor in revolution," over concrete explanations. This high-flown style can obscure real issues. For instance, rather than admitting, "We have a food shortage," a Juche-oriented narrative might say, "We must fortify the independence of agricultural production by unleashing the masses' revolutionary zeal in potato farming." The abstraction is often deliberate to create an aura of profundity and to avoid pinning the state down to specific, measurable targets. North Korean ideology is filled with such lofty plus vague phrases, repeated like mantras. This trait led to jokes that Juche documents are difficult to decipher, even for the party cadres. The propaganda expects citizens to memorize key slogans and definitions, not necessarily to logically analyze them. Those policies and promises can never be empirically proven wrong, because no concrete claims have ever been made. Juche, being somehow metaphysical, remains infallible. Meanwhile, on the ground, North Korean media ensures that Juche gets credit for every success. Did a bumper crop come in? It's thanks to the Juche farming method. Did the country manage to build a new dam or factory? That's the might of Juche self-reliance. Conversely, if something fails, officials might be accused of not adhering to Juche fully, or the ever-convenient foreign sanctions are blamed. Juche thus becomes a philosophical tautology. If good things happen, Juche worked. If bad things happen, Juche was not applied enough. It's unfalsifiable. Finally, contradiction numero 4, a socialist principle versus Korean nationalism. Though Juche is dressed up as a socialist theory, many observers note that its content is extremely nationalistic, even ethnocentric. It only speaks of the Korean people's destiny, Korean-style solutions, Korean this, Korean that, Korean ABC. But don't forget, it's a socialist principle, and any socialist principle emphasizes internationalism. Like Marx's original slogan says, "Workers of the world, unite." But the Juche ideology seems inapplicable to other nations. North Korea often claims solidarity with other anti-imperialist nations, but in practice, Juche emphasizes Chosen-centric pride above all. Over time, especially after Marxism-Leninism was dropped, Juche's nationalist core only grew more pronounced. North Koreans are taught that their country is following its own sacred path that others may not understand. A path that makes their small nation strong and dignified in the face of hostile big powers. After all, North Korea is the best Korea and would beat the imperialist USA anytime soon. The ideology thus fuels a kind of beleaguered national ego, explaining why sacrifice is necessary and why foreign criticism should be dismissed. At the same time, North Korea craves recognition of its Juche success from the outside. The regime insists, "We don't care what others think, we follow our own road." But state media is also quick to trumpet any foreign admirer's praise. For example, North Korean outlets often quote visiting delegations or obscure foreign communist groups who heap accolades on Pyongyang's achievements, using foreign voices to validate Juche's superiority. Kim Il-sung, in his last days, met the American pastor Billy Graham and received a Bible from him. North Korean state media then claimed that Graham referred to Kim Il-sung as a God who rules today's human world, a statement Graham's representative dismissed as delusional. Pyongyang often says it doesn't care about others' opinions, but in fact, it is very keen on international praise. It otherwise wouldn't quote foreign friends every day to prove itself. This hints that Juche, for all its inward focus, serves as a propaganda export and a point of pride on the world stage. To wrap up, the Juche idea teaches that people are in charge, be self-reliant, be independent, be creative, and follow Korea's own path. But it actually means that only the leader can decide the subject's destiny. Korea needs a lot of help, but let's not talk about it. And the Kims can redefine the idea whenever they want and use it to legitimize whatever they do. It's a highly malleable doctrine, less a consistent economic or political theory, and more a political theology. As our dear scholar Andrei Lankov observed, Juche encompasses everything the Kims find useful or praiseworthy at any given time. The only constants are ultranationalism, authoritarian leadership, and the narrative of heroic self-determination. Everything else in Juche can be bent or reinterpreted as needed. For the average North Korean, Juche functions as a credo to be revered rather than logically understood. North Korean citizens encounter it in daily life as something to salute, something to study in ideological sessions, something that justifies why their country is different and superior in its own way. It is simultaneously ubiquitous and mysterious, a bit like a religious doctrine, like the Trinity and papal infallibility. As with many belief systems, the myth is more powerful than the literal content. Juche's myth is that Korea will prevail against all odds by its own strength, under the wise guidance of its leaders, in the cause of some of its people's minor self-sacrifice. After you learned about Juche's origins, evolution, and self-contradictions, the final question is unavoidable. What does Juche actually mean for North Korea? At its most basic level, Juche has been the ideological spine that allowed the Kim family regime to survive conditions that otherwise should have killed it. It provided legitimacy and excuses for all brutalities. Kim Il-sung was no longer just a guerrilla-turned-dictator. He was reframed as the author of a new philosophy, a thinker who had supposedly solved the problems Marx left unfinished. Juche elevated politics into a belief. When the economy stagnated or isolation deepened, the regime could still appeal to faith. The system might be struggling, but the idea consistently remained pure. In practical terms, Juche transformed Marxism's dictatorship of the proletariat into something far more intimate, a dictatorship of the national father. The class disappeared, the supreme leader remained. Oppositions were no longer merely political heresy, but an ideological blasphemy. To dissent was to betray the very existence of Korean history, the entire Korean nation, and all Korean people. Juche functioned as an extraordinarily effective tool of discipline. It made obedience feel moral, even affectionate. At the same time, Juche served as a psychological coping mechanism. North Koreans were taught that hardship was not accidental, but chosen. Poverty was reframed as dignity. Suffering became proof of independence. To eat less but bow to no foreign lord was portrayed as superior to abundance under foreign influence. In this moral arithmetic, hunger could be noble, but dependency was certainly shameful. Juche turned endurance into virtue and sacrifice, and essentially into the North Korean identity. The irony, of course, is that North Korea's self-reliance had never been real. The country survived for decades on foreign aid. During the famine, it lived on international food assistance. Even today, its economy quietly depends on cross-border trade with Russia and China. When borders closed during COVID, shortages worsened immediately. Juche failed its own stress test, but hey, here is the wonderful Juche ideology, which absorbed all the state's failures. The solution to the collapse of self-reliance was simply more self-reliance. The logic was circular and therefore indestructible. Many observers once assumed Juche would die with Kim Il-sung or collapse with the socialist bloc. It didn't. The dear leader Kim Jong-il doubled down, reframing Juche through military-first politics. Later, Kim Jong-un inherited this poor but nuclear-armed state and refined the language again. Now, Juche supposedly meant putting people first. The slogans changed, but the structure didn't. Juche remained flexible enough to justify both missile tests and market reforms, geopolitical isolation and special economic zones opening, repression and selective generosity. So, do North Koreans actually believe it? Some do, some don't. Many probably believe parts of it, doubt others, and perform the rest. But after 3 generations, Juche nationalism is deeply embedded in the civil society. Even defectors often retain pride in Korean independence or reverence for Kim Il-sung as a historical figure. The myth is emotionally powerful because it taps into a real historical trauma, which is Korea's long experience of domination by stronger powers. Juche weaponized that memory and turned it into loyalty. Ultimately, Juche has been less about economics or governance than identity. It gave North Korea a story about itself, one that explained why it must be different, isolated, defiant, and obedient. It replaced empirical success with moral victory. As long as the story holds, the system holds. Meanwhile, Juche is also a trap. An ideology built on absolute self-reliance leaves little room to admit weakness or ask for help. Any compromise risks ideological humiliation. So the regime bends reality instead of revising doctrine, doing in practice what it denies in theory, and then calling that flexibility a triumph. Finally, comrades, consider this. Juche, the ideology of self-reliance, created one of the most inwardly dependent societies on earth, dependent not on foreign powers, but on the Juche belief itself. The system runs on faith in the leader and faith in the idea that suffering has meaning, like Sisyphus rolling a boulder. North Korea became reliant on self-reliance. In that sense, Juche is not really an ideology in the classical sense. It is a metaphysical survival tool. It doesn't promise prosperity, it promises justification. It doesn't solve problems, it explains why problems must be endured. And it has worked, not because it is true, but because it is useful. So here is Juche, defined by us. North Korea fired Marx and Lenin, replaced class with nation, replaced theory with a godly father, called it philosophy, and built a country on its belief. Hungry, proud, isolated, nuclear-armed, and still standing. This is Juche. And as long as the Juche idea survives, so does the state.